American corporate propaganda and schools teach that Richard Nixon was a corrupt, horrible president. This is because he was popular with the American people and took actions to benefit them, at the expense of the deep state. During his 5 years in the White House, Americans saw a reduction of involvement in the Vietnam War, détente with the Soviet Union, deep cuts in military spending, and the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. In 1969, Nixon upset the Pentagon by ordering bioweapons labs closed and all stockpiles destroyed. Nixon ended American involvement in Vietnam combat in 1973 and the military draft that same year. His visit to China in 1972 eventually led to diplomatic relations. Nixon engaged in intense negotiations with Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev that led to agreements for increased trade and 2 landmark arms control treaties, SALT I, the first comprehensive limitation pact signed by the 2 superpowers, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which ended the nuclear arms race. Nixon and Brezhnev proclaimed a new era of peaceful coexistence and reduced military spending. Nixon worked with Congress to slash military spending 25%. There was massive opposition to these efforts from corporate America and the Pentagon. Nixon rose to power as a loyal member of the deep state, but went rogue once he reached the top. He told friends that he didn't trust the CIA, thought their intelligence was poor, and that the CIA was involved in the Kennedy assassination. Nixon was a Quaker from a modest background who served in the Navy during World War II. He had served in the U.S. House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, and 8 years as vice president. He knew how Washington worked. Nixon got things done, so was popular with the American people, and would easily win re-election in 1972, giving him 4 more years to dismantle the deep state. Several books have appeared that explain why powerful people wanted to remove Nixon from office, starting with Silent Coup, published in 1992. Longtime Republican operative Roger Stone authored a 2014 book, Nixon's Secrets. In this clip, he explains why Nixon was targeted for a coup.
And I think that the great tragedy here is that the great accomplishments of Richard Nixon get lost in the ashes of Watergate. This is a man who opened the door to China. Let's start from the beginning. This is a man who ended the Kennedy-Johnson war in Vietnam. Yes, he increased the bombing to give a cover to withdraw our troops and get them home, which he did. He gets no credit for this. He overruled the Pentagon. He overruled his own Defense Department. He got American boys out of harm's way because it was clear to him that there was not going to be a success the way we were conducting the war. It is not his fault that South Vietnam fell, because the second part of the Nixon proposal was to fund the South Vietnamese after we left, and we failed to do that, and they fell. This is a man who opened the door to China over the objections of his own government. In 1969, it is Nixon who tells Kissinger, I think I'm going to go to China, and Kissinger says, this can be heard in the tapes, you're crazy. This is a man who then used the China card to squeeze deep arms concessions out of the Soviets, saving this country hundreds of millions of dollars. The Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Environmental Protection Agency. In those days, we had no environmental protection. Yes, I agree, those things have gone too far in the age of big government, but the idea itself of minimal environmental protection, to have clean water and clean air, no, I think that was a good thing. Ending the military draft, the 18-year-old vote, the war on cancer, federal revenue sharing, desegregating the schools in the South without violence or bloodshed.
The powerful people who plotted to remove Nixon included owners of America's most prestigious newspapers. It was no secret that Nixon disliked the political power of Jewish groups in the United States, referring to the New York Times as the Jew York Times, which engaged in a campaign to demonize him. The nation's other premier newspaper, the Washington Post, led the effort to oust Nixon. It was purchased in bankruptcy by Eugene Meyer in 1933, who came from a wealthy Jewish family and had just stepped down as chairman of the Federal Reserve. He appointed his son-in-law, Philip Graham, as publisher, who later served in the CIA's predecessor, called the OSS during World War II. Graham maintained close contact with his fellow upper-class military intelligence veterans who joined the newly formed CIA in 1947. Graham promoted the CIA's goals in his newspaper and hired former CIA officers. The editor of the Washington Post during the Nixon years was Ben Bradley, who served in the Office of Naval Intelligence during World War II. He is shown here with Graham's wife and two young reporters assigned to help overthrow Nixon, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Bob Woodward is probably a career covert CIA agent. He graduated from the CIA's favorite source for agents, Yale University. Woodward became a Navy intelligence officer who served on two ships and then ended up in charge of White House communications, which is run by the Navy. 2 years after leaving the Navy and the White House, Woodward somehow got a job at the CIA's favorite news outlet called the Washington Post. In 2015, a federal judge ordered the release of transcripts of legal interviews with Nixon, despite strong opposition from the U.S. government. They document how, in 1970, the Joint Chiefs of Staff ordered White House military personnel, to include Lieutenant Bob Woodward, to spy on President Nixon and his staff. The White House was bugged, phone calls recorded, and documents copied for the Pentagon and probably the CIA. See the article linked below for details. Before this coup began, it was necessary to replace Vice President Spiro Agnew with someone from the deep state team. Nearly every major American political leader becomes wealthy through their political influence, so there is always dirt to be found in their past. Agnew was investigated by the U.S. Attorney for the District of Maryland on suspicion of criminal conspiracy, bribery, extortion, and tax fraud. Agnew was accused of accepting kickbacks from contractors during his time as Baltimore County Executive and Governor of Maryland, and had continued this into his time as Vice President. After months of maintaining his innocence, Agnew pleaded no contest to a single felony charge of tax evasion and resigned from office. The deep state then pressured Nixon to select someone from their team as vice president. Gerald Ford was an unknown congressman from Michigan who was somehow selected to serve on the Warren Commission that conducted a shady investigation into the assassination of President John Kennedy. According to a 1963 FBI memo that was released to the public in 2008, Ford relayed information about the commission's efforts to Deputy FBI Director Cartha DeLoach. In 1997, papers were released showing that Ford had edited the Warren Commission's final report to imply one bullet struck Kennedy several inches higher than shown by the autopsy to better fit the odd single bullet theory. After his service with the Warren Commission, Ford quickly became the House Minority Leader, Vice President, and then President. The head of security for Nixon's re-election campaign was career deep stater James McCord. He was a former FBI agent and CIA officer who was once in charge of security for CIA headquarters and was good friends with the Dulles brothers. Retired FBI agent Gordon Liddy paid McCord and other CIA operatives to conduct a series of burglaries in the Watergate building that housed the Democratic National Committee and some anti-war groups. They collected information on Democrats and also a prostitution ring for high-level government officials. McCord agreed to take a fall for the CIA to oust Nixon by ensuring his team was caught, thus allowing him to reveal secret information about White House activities. A standard procedure for covert action for low-level crimes like burglary is to bring in a few unknown characters from out of state. If they were caught with their CIA-provided fake IDs, they would make bail and disappear. In this odd case, McCord led the burglary team himself, consisting of known White House CIA operatives, 4 of whom worked directly for the committee to re-elect the president. One burglar Eugenio Martinez, pictured here, later stated in an oral history for the Nixon Library, the video's linked below, that he had been surprised by all the mistakes and the tradecraft errors. He said before they went in, they followed standard procedure and surrendered all their personal items and ID to McCord, who provided them fake IDs. James McCord placed these items in a briefcase that he inexplicitly carried with him during the burglary. The team had a locksmith who opened doors, but McCord insisted they tape the door latches open for their exit. This confused the burglars since they could open the door to leave, and the tape might alert someone, which is exactly what happened. A roaming security guard noticed the taped doors and called police, who arrested the burglars and grabbed McCord's briefcase full of their IDs. The team had a lookout to warn them if a security guard went to their floor, but McCord had turned off his walkie-talkie, so the lookout couldn't warn them. During their court arraignment the next day, the judge asked McCord where he worked. He could have truthfully said that he was a retired government worker, but he blurted out in open court that he worked for the CIA, thus tipping off the press to follow this story. The burglars were CIA professionals who knew how to keep quiet. All they faced was a burglary charge that would lead to a few months in jail, after which they should get a big cash payoff. McCord was the most experienced man on the team, yet we are told that he quickly cracked and began telling everything he knew about White House activities. This justified a witch hunt by congressional committees looking for dirt on Nixon. Bob Woodward began reporting on dirty tricks, criminal activity in the Nixon White House from a confidential source. McCord was allowed free on bail for months to testify against Nixon, then only served 4 months in jail before disappearing to enjoy a nice retirement. Carl Oglesby, the author of The Yankee and Cowboy War, argues that McCord was part of a CIA plot against Nixon, something endorsed by former CIA officer Miles Copeland, who claimed that McCord had led the Watergate burglars into a trap. Eugenio Martinez was interviewed for this book. He stated that McCord knew the security guards who let their team into the building because McCord said they were going to the Federal Reserve office. McCord also knew the arresting officer, Detective Lieutenant Carl Schofler, who is chief of the Special District Police. Schofler was oddly working overtime after midnight with 3 other officers and sitting in a parked car outside the Watergate building when security called for police backup. Nixon was angry when the Watergate burglars appeared in the news. He knew nothing about Watergate and didn't need dirt on the Democrats since he would easily win re-election. In a meeting recorded in the White House, Nixon demanded that CIA Director Richard Helms inform the FBI that Watergate was a national security matter and to drop its investigation. He told Helms that he had always supported CIA activities and he knew, quote, who shot John, referencing the Kennedy assassination, and implying he can start leaking secrets too. Helms met with the FBI but claimed they refused, so Nixon fired Helms. This led to a year of investigations, court cases, and negative news stories about Nixon until the majority of Americans thought Nixon should resign because he obstructed justice by attempting to squash the Watergate investigation. The CIA coup to oust Richard Nixon is unknown to the American public, and details are debatable, although anyone can conclude Nixon was ousted by reading the historical record and connecting the dots. It was shocking to see a January 2023 segment on the popular Tucker Carlson news show where he exposed this plot. It was not shocking that Carlson's segment was ignored by the rest of our corporate media. His video is linked below, where Fox News decided to hide its content with the title, Biden is Done, even though most of the segment is about the plot to oust Nixon. Richard M. Nixon was a great American president who played political hardball to benefit the American people. He was no saint. His secret bombings of Cambodia and the overthrow of President Allende in Chile were horrible. However, he was acting on the recommendations from the CIA and Pentagon, as all his predecessors had done since World War II. The former CIA people he hired to get things done outside normal channels were sinister criminals who disregarded laws, and one eventually turned on him. The Nixon administration was guilty of numerous crimes around the globe, yet he was impeached because he attempted to cover up a minor burglary.
When I first took the oath of office as president 5.5 years ago, I made this sacred commitment to consecrate my office, my energies, and all the wisdom I can summon to the cause of peace among nations. I've done my very best in all the days since to be true to that pledge. As a result of these efforts, I am confident that the world is a safer place today, not only for the people of America, but for the people of all nations. And that all of our children have a better chance than before of living in peace rather than dying in war. This, more than anything, is what I hoped to achieve when I sought the presidency. This, more than anything, is what I hope will be my legacy to you, to our country, as I leave the presidency.